Hi guys, welcome back. Today I'm here with some recommendations for you for Nonfiction November. So Nonfiction November is fast approaching. By the time this video goes up, it might already be Nonfiction November. And so I thought I would put together a recommendation list of some nonfiction books that I really love that you might want to consider if you're looking for things to add to your TBR. I'm going to preface this by saying that I have very specific interests when it comes to types of nonfiction books that I like, and so you are going to see that pretty clearly in the books that I'm going to recommend to you. Among these are some of my all-time favorite books. You can find other types of recommendations from other people, but the nonfiction that most appeals to me are books that in some way deal with race relations or feminism. So most of the recommendations on this list are going to fall into those categories. If that is not something that you are interested in, this might not be the right recommendation video for you, but if those are things you're interested in, or if you're just curious to see what some of my favorite nonfiction books are, then keep on watching. So I'm kind of going to do this by dividing it up into some categories. So first I have a category of books that I'm going to talk about that deal with race in America, specifically focused on Black people and African Americans in America that I think are really, really fantastic and worth picking up. Then I have some books I want to recommend that are about intersectional feminism. So they are about feminism, but from the perspective of including people of color in the way that we talk about some of those issues, and they're books that I really love a lot. Then I have some books that are history and memoir. And then finally, I just wanted to share one of my most recent nonfiction reads that I just loved a lot that doesn't fit into any of these categories really, but is still one that I think is great and worth picking up. So to start out, let's talk about some books that deal with race relations in America. And I have 4 books in this category from 2 authors, and are, I think, some of the best public thinkers on these issues happening right now. And they're quite different from each other in some ways that we're going to talk about, but I think all 4 of these books are really, really good and worth picking up. So the first author that I want to talk about is Ta-Nehisi. He is pretty well known for his nonfiction, including essays that he's written in The Atlantic and some of the books that he's written. He also recently came out with his first adult novel, which I read last month and really loved. And so I wanted to give you guys a couple of options for entry points into his nonfiction work, all of which I think is really, really fantastic and well worth picking up. If you're looking for something that is on the smaller side and quicker and easier to get through, I would recommend checking out Between the World and Me. This was a National Book Award winner, and this is structured as a letter to his son. It's really moving, and it addresses so many different things in terms of what it means to be Black in America. Part of this is his memoir of what it was like for him growing up as a young Black man in America from childhood up through adulthood, and part of it is about what it means to raise Black and brown boys in America and his hopes for his son and what that looks like and what that means. I think it's really, really good. The audiobook for this one is also pretty fantastic. He does read it himself. It's easy to listen to, and it's pretty short. It's not a very long book. It is only 152 pages, so you can get through this probably all in one sitting, but I think it's really powerful, and I also think it's a nice introduction to his work if you haven't read it before. It kind of pulls in a lot of ideas that you see throughout other books that he'll write. And the other book of his that I've read and really loved is We Were 8 Years in Power, An American Tragedy. So this is an interesting book. It's actually a collection of 8 articles that he wrote for The Atlantic, one during each year of the Obama presidency, and it's pulled together in this collection with little essays that he writes in between each of them. It covers a lot of ground, a lot of history. It deals with current issues surrounding racism. It deals with the history of slavery and racism and oppression of Black people in America. It deals with mass incarceration and problems with the justice system. There's just so much that it covers in here. It's really, really rich, and it also will probably link you to other resources. If you're interested in reading further into any of the topics that he covers, Clearly, he did a ton of research for all of the things that he wrote, and he references a lot of other historians and authors and philosophers and different people. So I would highly recommend this one. My husband and I read this aloud together, and it was really interesting and powerful and generated a lot of great discussion points. It's one that I would love to revisit in the future. One thing that I will say about Ta-Nehisi Coates that is good to be aware of is he doesn't necessarily have the most hopeful perspective on things. Coming out of this, you really get the sense that he doesn't expect things to get significantly better and doesn't see an easy path to improvement. He is also an atheist, and he's pretty upfront about that. We are not, but I think that his perspective is an important one and one that is well worth taking in and considering and listening to what he has to say. So yeah, that's Ta-Nehisi Coates. The other author that I really love as a thinker about this is Ibram X. Kendi. He is a professor, I think at George Washington University, an American University. He is a researcher and professor at American University and has written 2 books that I've read this year, and both of them made my favorites of the year list. I love both of them. I think they're both really important. The first one is definitely a tome. Again, with this one, I'm going to recommend the audiobook. The audio is really good, and I think it's a good way to consume it. This is Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. This was also a national book winner. And whew, man, it is so good and so intense and well researched. This traces the history of racism and racist ideas from the earliest history that we know, going up through early American history, all the way up through the end of the Obama presidency. And again, I think this is really, really powerful. It's very well researched. It is thought-provoking, and you will learn a whole lot from it if you decide to pick it up. I absolutely loved it. Highly recommend. And then the follow-up to this is a book that was published this year, which I recently read, and that is How to Be an Anti-Racist. This is, in a lot of ways, a follow-up to Stamped from the Beginning. It's sort of like, okay, given all of this, given what racism is, what it looks like in America, then what? What do we do as a response, and what does resistance and change look like in a variety of different areas? And so this book is structured as part memoir, part essay. So part of this is him talking about his own experiences, but then also sharing a really clear vision that he has for a path forward and what it means to not just not be racist, and he would argue that maybe that's not actually a thing we can not be, but to be actively anti-racist. And so I think this is really, really helpful and really powerful. I do think it's interesting to contrast, to read Ibram X. Kendi versus Ta-Nehisi Coates. There's a lot that they agree on, a lot that they say similarly, but I would say Ibram X. Kendi definitely has a more hopeful view of the future and has a really clear vision of what he believes that would look like and what a path forward would look like. So yeah, those are his 2 books. Those are the 2 authors that I'm really recommend if this is a topic that you're interested in diving into. I think they are fantastic and well worth reading. Next, talking about feminism and intersectional feminism, I have 3 books to recommend to you. And if you aren't familiar with the phrase intersectional or intersectionality, it is a way of talking about how different types of oppressions can exist together and create new forms of oppression. So for example, there can be racism against Black people, and there can be sexism against women. But if somebody identifies as a Black woman, then they have what is known as an intersectional identity, and they face oppression at the intersection of both of those identities, being both Black and being a woman. Especially I think today, when we're talking about feminism and when we're talking about gender oppression, it's really important to take into account people of color in this conversation, and that there's been a lot of problematic things associated with traditional white feminism that is not intersectional in its view. And so because of that, I'm going to recommend 3 books by women of color that I think are really good at getting to the heart of some of this. The first one is a very small little book, and for some people, this is going to be oversimplified. If you've already been pretty well introduced to the ideas of feminism and feminist theory and what it means to be a feminist and why that's important, then this might seem a little bit simplistic to you, but I think this is something that is well worth everybody having and reading It's not perfect, it definitely leaves out a few key things, but overall I think it's a really accessible introduction point, and that is We Should All Be Feminists by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She is a Nigerian author who writes both fiction and nonfiction. I really, really appreciate her work, and this is a very small, quick little book that I think was actually originally based on a TED Talk that she gave about why everybody, men, women, everyone should be a feminist and what that means. One thing that I will say that this leaves out is trans women and gender non-binary people. So that is a concern that some people have brought up, but in general I do think this is a nice little introduction to the basic ideas of feminism and feminist theory. It's very, very short. You can also watch the TED Talk if you want to do that as well, and I just think it's an accessible entryway. I have a couple of other books that I've read recently that I really loved. The first one is actually more of a memoir and essay collection. This is Eloquent Rage, A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower by Brittney Cooper. I think this book is really good if you want an introduction to Black feminism and some of the problems of the stereotype of the angry Black woman and why it's important for all women, and specifically in this case Black women, to be able to express anger and rage. So like I said, this is a collection of essays that integrates some kind of memoir-like things about Brittney Cooper's life with her thoughts and ideas about feminism and Black feminism and anger, and I think that this is really good. And by the same token, I have another book that is also generally about women and anger and rage that I just absolutely loved. This was one of my favorite books that I read last year, and that is Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger by Soraya Chemaly. I cannot say more good things about this book. I think it's absolutely wonderful and important and does such a good job of breaking down a lot of the forms of oppression that women experience and the ways that women are taught to hold back their anger and to be nice, and the trauma that women experience with sexual assault and the Me Too movement. I just think this does such a good job of getting into a lot of really meaty issues, and it is a book that is intersectional, which I love. Soraya is a woman of color from a mixed background, and she does a really good job of talking about the intersectionality of feminism and oppression in this book and the way that she discusses things. So I think this is also just really, really fantastic and well worth reading for anybody, honestly. Next, I have 3 books that I'm putting in this like historical slash memoir nonfiction category, and you're probably going to notice that again all 3 of these books are written by women of color, and honestly, like, this just ends up being what my favorite and most of my favorite nonfiction is. There are exceptions, but these are the books that I've kept on my shelves, so among really some of my favorites. I've read some other really great nonfiction, but yeah, anyway. So the next book that I want to recommend to you that is kind of a heavier one, but again, one that I think is really good and really powerful, is Hunger, A Memoir of My Body by Roxane Gay. Roxane Gay is another author who writes fiction and nonfiction. She is Haitian American, and she is a queer Black fat woman and addresses a lot of that in here. I think this is really interesting and eye-opening. One of the things it talks a lot about is what it is like to be a person of size living in America and the different types of oppression that she's faced through that, and her own personal struggles and trauma, and the way that even her relationship with food and with her body is linked to sexual assault from her childhood. And so it's pretty heavy, it's pretty dark, but I think it's really important and really eye-opening and well worth reading, and I just love her writing as well. I think her writing is really beautiful. It was interesting to me too reading this because I know coming out of it, she kind of differentiates in the book in ways that I hadn't really thought about before between being like really fat and Lane Bryant fat, and like that with the idea that people who can shop at Lane Bryant are in almost a different category than people who are larger than that, and she really gets into what that means, and it's interesting to me to consider the types of privilege that come with not just being thin but also with being like on the lower end of fatness. And anyway, it's really thought-provoking and well worth picking up, so I would recommend that. Do check content warnings on this because it does get pretty dark and there's like a lot of stuff in there, but I really loved it. I think it's great. Everything I've read from her has been pretty wonderful, honestly. Another book that I read this year and really liked, although with this one I'm definitely going to recommend the audiobook to you because I think reading the physical book would probably drag a bit, but this is Hidden Figures by Margot Lee Shetterley. Also, highly recommend seeing the film. The film adaptation of this is fantastic. The book is in some ways quite different from the film. It talks about a lot more women and goes much earlier on in the space program, but it talks about Black women behind the scenes who are mathematicians and engineers and kind of what that was like for them all the way from like pre-civil rights era up through almost modern day, and it is fascinating and really, really, I think, important and powerful. Again, I'm going to say I think the audiobook is probably the way to go here if you listen to audiobooks, because there is quite a bit of technical information and the pace of this is a little bit slow, so I do think the audiobook helps with that, but I still really loved it. I love that she's bringing these women's lives to light that were lost for so long, and if nothing else, definitely go see the movie. The movie doesn't get as much richness and content as the book does, but it's still really fantastic and well done. And then the last book in this category that I want to recommend is actually a graphic memoir. I actually love graphic novels as a way to do nonfiction. I think it can make it really accessible. The book that I want to recommend to you is The Best We Could Do by Thi Bui. It's a illustrated memoir by a Vietnamese American woman that is really interesting. So the author of the book was born 3 months before the end of the Vietnam War, and her parents were refugees that got from there to the United States. By the time they got to the United States, she was a few years old, but she had 2 older siblings, and then her mother was very pregnant when they fled Vietnam and actually gave birth in a refugee camp. It's a wild story, so it traces her family history and then what it was like for her in America. There is a lot of trauma, both in what her parents experienced growing up and then generationally in the way that that then got transferred to them as children. So it's pretty intense and heartbreaking at times, but also kind of beautiful, and it's interesting seeing her then become a mother and think back on this family history and what she wants to pass on to her children. So yeah, definitely recommend this. I think it's so well done. If you are looking for other graphic memoirs, I don't have them with me, but I would recommend checking out Persepolis or March. Those are also really, really great nonfiction graphic novels that I would for sure recommend. And then on a much lighter note, I have one other nonfiction book I want to recommend to you that is only like loosely tied with any of the other books that I mentioned, although you could call this like maybe kind of feminist. This is Monster, She Wrote: The Women Who Pioneered Horror and Speculative Fiction by Lisa Kroger and Melanie R. Anderson. This is the most recent nonfiction book that I read. I actually did this as a buddy read with Bree Hill, who I love, and both of us really, really enjoyed this. This is really fascinating if you're at all interested in horror or speculative fiction. It documents the lives of these women who pioneered those genres through different eras. It's really nicely curated and it offers great reading lists. So if you do read this, you will definitely come out with a much longer TBR than you had to start. And it's also just like a really beautiful book with great illustrations, and it's got a light tone to it. It's really accessible and readable and fun, but also just so fascinating. So to give you an idea, it is broken up into different parts. So first we have the Founding Mothers, which is mostly women from the Victorian era, but includes one woman who lived in the 1600s who is fascinating and so wild. Like, it's so interesting to me to learn about the women who lived during these time periods and had these unconventional lives and were doing things that were so far ahead of their time. So yeah, definitely recommend this one. I loved it, and I think it's one that's easy to read because you can kind of break it up into bits through Nonfiction November and read like a section a day. That was kind of what we did, is read like about a section a day for Spookathon. Definitely recommend that. So there you go. Those are my recommendations for you for Nonfiction November. If you are interested in the same types of nonfiction that I am, I wholeheartedly recommend all of the books that I talked about in this video. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts or feelings on any of these books. Tell me if you're going to be participating in Nonfiction November. And for your question of the day, what kinds of nonfiction books appeal to you? Clearly, I have a type. There are other things that I'm sometimes interested in reading, like if I want something lighter, sometimes celebrity memoirs can be fun, but they're never among my favorites where I'll keep them on my shelves. This gives you a pretty good idea of most of the types of nonfiction nonfiction that I am into. But everybody is really different, and it's always so fascinating to me around Nonfiction November seeing everybody's TBRs because they vary widely and there's so many different kinds of nonfiction you can pick up. So, like I said, question of the day, tell me what kinds of nonfiction do you like to read, and maybe tell me one of your favorite nonfiction books that you've read recently if it's something that you read. If you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.